I've had about 9 jobs where I was employed working for somebody else. And these are the biggest lessons I learned on each job, which is what I use every time I'm coaching people in business or people who are employed and are trying to rise up. In my first ever job as a taxi driver, I learned that the biggest intelligence organization in the world is the taxi organization, because what happens is when the taxi driver is moving from spot to spot across a city or a state, the amount of intelligence collected there is way more valuable than any other business can know as far as the movement of personas. My second job, the biggest lesson I learned was how to sell. I learned that business is all ultimately about selling. The most important skill you need to learn is to sell. The third job I ever had was in the British Youth Parliament. And what I learned there is when it comes to who gets the right to sit at the table, it actually does matter where you come from. It actually does matter who you are. You can be the smartest guy in the room, but politics comes down to management and the balance of interest. I learned how to politic when I worked for President Rupiah Banda as education advisor. I learned that in every organization that you can think of, your school, your church, the way you work, the decision of whether or not something happens always comes down to one person. In fact, in every organization, there is less than 3 people who really make the decision. So, for example, in your church, if one person decides tomorrow there is no service, it doesn't matter what the rest of the congregation says, tomorrow there is no service. My next job, I worked for Minister Xavier Kasukwere in Zimbabwe. What I learned there is the value of a resource, that Africa has got a population of young people who are going to bed every night, sleeping on top of gold, on top of diamonds, on top of copper and silver, and we have absolutely no idea. We wake up in the morning and we say we're looking for a job, and investors enter your country and they say we own the mines, and yet there is no seed they bring to put into an intrinsic setup where they say, oh, we mined the gold and therefore we're taking the gold out. If you don't know about your resources in a country, you will be taken advantage of. In my next job, I worked for a man called his name was Nema, and I learned that you must listen more than you talk when you're leading a sensitive collection of people. In my next job, I worked for another minister. His name was Minister Mushore, and I learned about blind spots because he thought he was going in one direction with the whole team, but loyalties in big organizations are a thing, and he was blind spotted at every angle until he knew absolutely nothing about what he was doing, and he was lights out, nobody at home. My next job, I worked for the champion of corruption, the president's nephew, President Robert Mugabe's nephew. His name was Patrick Shiwawu. And what I learned is corruption is very normal to people who are corrupt. You think that they know that they're being corrupt, but instead they actually know them. When corruption has been normalized, it's very difficult to even explain whether it is or it isn't anymore. It starts by you got a car, and then when they gave you a car, they gave you fuel. Then they brought you another car. They said, well, you need an off-road. And then they brought you another car. They said you need a sedan. And before you know it, you're asking, when is the next car coming? My last job I ever worked for somebody else, I was working for Minister of Finance in Zimbabwe, Minister Mthuli Ncube. What I learned there is capital will go wherever it is wanted. So, for example, if you take money and the money is coming out of a prostitute's bra, and the prostitute walks into a supermarket to buy a loaf of bread, they will buy a loaf of bread. If you take a murderer, if you take a rapist and you give them the same amount of money, they walk into a bar to buy a bottle of whiskey, money will always buy whiskey. So money does not go to a place because it is coming from a good place or it is going to a good place. Money will go wherever it is accepted. So if a country is going to attract resources or going to attract money, it needs to stop looking at who is bringing it and needs to look at the value of the resource itself. That's the 9 things I learned from being employed.